Sup, guys? Finally, a winning day for once. 4-2 with the 2-0 in hockey. Although the Columbus Blue Jackets tried to blow it, it looked like I was gonna have a 3-1 start and then potentially go 3-3 with the stupid late night games. I wound up going 2-2 in college basketball, 2-0 in the NHL. Columbus Blue Jackets last night had a 3-1 lead in the middle of the second period. It was looking pretty good for them, and they blew the lead, allowed the game to be tied, and then still finally wound up winning, thankfully. They were the better team in the game. I mean, they were winning for the entire game. I think they had the better statistics in the game as well, so that would have been a pretty unlucky one. And then the other one was completely unlucky with UNLV. UNLV was winning by around like 8, 9, 10 points for the entire second half. They pretty much had the game put away. They were winning by 9 with like 3 minutes left. And then they allowed Nevada to go on a 10-0 run and let Nevada close the game in a 16-4 run and wound up losing the game by 3 when they're up by 9 with 3 minutes left. UNLV was up by 9. The game was basically over. They had the lead. They were winning the game. The game was playing more to their style. I don't know how it could have unraveled like that in the final minute or two of the game. It's just completely insane that happened. But we still had a win out of it. A 4-2 day, not too bad. Trying to turn it around here. It felt good yesterday, but we really have a lot of turning around to do here. Moving to today, 2 college basketball plays, just because why not, I guess, and then one play in hockey, actually on the small hockey slate. College basketball, play number 1. The market looks to be in agreement with this, and it's moving up. So I think probably this one, maybe you would need to get on it faster. But this game's happening at noon in less than 2 hours at this point. So Florida Atlantic -5. Ken Baum has this at 4, but this is a game where I think the public is actually going to come in against Florida Atlantic here. They've actually moved up from a little bit from 5 to 5 with juice, and it's headed towards the 5.5. South Florida has 62% of the tickets, but only 55% of the cash. So I think some of the recreational bettors are coming in on South Florida thinking there's going to be value here, even though Florida Atlantic is just in the rankings right now at 24th. With South Florida's ahead of them in the conference by 1 game with only 1 loss in the American Athletic Conference. Although Florida Atlantic actually has the better overall record by 1 game, I guess, because they're 20-5 to South Florida's 18-5. But people are going to look at this and see South Florida's slightly ahead of them in the standings. In first place, people see South Florida in all the bracketologies that are coming out because the stupid bracketologies, Joe Lunardi and whatever, he basically just looks at who's currently leading the conference, and then that's who he has winning the auto bid from that conference, even if it's a team that's not even close to the best team in the conference, and that is the case with South Florida here. I have been talking about this for a while now. South Florida, Ken Baum has them ranked down at 101. He actually has South Florida behind Charlotte, SMU, Florida Atlantic, not UAB, almost behind UAB. He has them behind Memphis, North Texas. So he has them actually as the 6th best team in the conference, even though they're leading the conference, which is completely insane, really. Something's got to turn around, and this is part of the reason why I'm on this game. Even though he only has Florida Atlantic winning this one by 4. Florida Atlantic, he has up at 32nd in the country. Of course, this is an experienced Florida Atlantic team. I mean, they made the Final Four last year. They've been in big games like this plenty of times. They have a lot of experience. A lot of those guys from last year's team returned to this team, so they're used to playing big games like this. So I don't think that's going to be a problem. And this game is close to their home, so the road aspect of it, I think, gets thrown out a little bit. I don't know how often they play at South Florida because they just moved over to this conference this year. I forget if South Florida was even – I think South Florida's been in the American for longer, but I don't even know. I'm not even sure. But either way, I mean, the colleges are close to each other, and Florida Atlantic plays at a similar tempo to South Florida. So Ken Baum has them at 193 in tempo, South Florida at 190 in tempo, so very close. They like to play similar pacing, so that's going to help Florida Atlantic as well, because Florida Atlantic is not going to be thrown out of their element because South Florida likes to play at the same pace that they do, and it's just that Florida Atlantic is just a way better team, especially offensively. Ken Palm has South Florida down at 122nd offensively and 97th defensively. And he has Florida Atlantic better on both sides of the ball, 15th offensively and 85th defensively. So way, way better offensively. So South Florida, you can see them struggle to score many times. So I think that might be something that might do them in here. But this is just, again, this is just one of those games where like the records are just not indicative of how good these teams actually are, even though the rankings are maybe a little bit more correct, with Florida Atlantic actually being overranked a little bit at 24th. But I think people are going to throw that out and just see the records and think there's value on South Florida. See that Florida Atlantic has lost a couple of road games in the conference. Yeah, they did. They lost to UAB and Charlotte on the road. Charlotte right behind them in the conference, and UAB pretty good in the conference. So the Ken Palm actually has UAB ranked lower than who am I even talking? That's South Florida, but he has Charlotte ranked ahead of them. But the UAB game was just a tough game. I mean, I don't know what to tell you. It was on the road, and Florida Atlantic had already beaten UAB once this year at home by double digits. So maybe there's a little bit of a revenge aspect there. I don't know. But South Florida, their schedule's been way easier, man. They've been beating up on all the worst teams in the conference. They've already beaten Temple, UTSA, East Carolina, Rice, Tulsa, Rice twice, actually. They beat Wichita, who's way down near the bottom as well. So they've beaten all of the bottom teams in the conference, even though, yes, they also beat North Texas, who's decent. They did beat Memphis, who's decent. Barely winning both of those games, but North Texas on the road. Tough place to play, so I'll give them credit for that one. They did also lose at UAB, which Florida Atlantic also did, but the schedule's been, they've actually played Temple twice as well. The schedule's just been way, way easier for South Florida. And if you look at what Ken Palm has for their schedule strength as well, he's got South Florida. Well, he also has South Florida, the 40th luckiest team. So he's saying that their record is looks a lot better than they actually are. So he has South Florida escaping in a lot of close games and stuff like that, and having more wins than they probably should. And he has them with the 237th strongest schedule, which is pretty bad, pretty low, in the bottom third in strength of schedule, and 311th out of conference. So they played a really weak out of conference schedule. So they're not very battle tested, even though they've had a couple of decent wins in this conference. Florida Atlantic, Ken Palm has them at 96th overall in strength of schedule and 39th out of conference. So they played a much more difficult out of conference schedule, having been, in the Final Four last year. They scheduled some bigger opponents in the non-conference. So it just is all about the records are just very misleading in this game, which is why I like this. The records are misleading, and Florida Atlantic has been behind South Florida all year, even though they are actually the best team power ratings wise in this conference and have been like the whole year. They've just been lagging behind and sitting behind the whole time. But if they win this game, I believe they will be back in first place in the American, because they'll tie South Florida again, and they'll jump up ahead of them because they have the tiebreaker against them. They do have the tiebreaker over Charlotte as well, because they're already sitting ahead of Charlotte right now, despite being tied in the conference. I think the first tiebreaker is overall record, so Florida Atlantic has that against both South Florida and Charlotte. And this is the only meeting between them and South Florida this year. So if they win this, they'll have the tiebreaker over South Florida as well. I mean, yes, this is a big game for South Florida because they know Florida Atlantic is basically the team that's standing in the way of them maintaining the conference lead. But Florida Atlantic is just the better team in almost every aspect. And there's no real situation here. Neither team's coming off like a big game or anything like that. So both teams are going to be focused on this game. Like I said, I don't think it's a road spot that's going to throw Florida Atlantic off, because the tempo is going to be right in line with what they like to play. Geographically, it's very close as well. So I think Florida Atlantic is going to be fine in this game, and they're going to want it, man. Like I said, I think they know they're the best team in this conference, that they've been behind South Florida. They've been behind in the conference this whole time. They see South Florida being thrown into all these bracketologies, even though most bracketologies, even if South Florida wins the conference, most bracketologies also still have Florida Atlantic just getting in as an at-large anyway. But I think Florida Atlantic has something to prove here, man. Prove that they're still the top dog. Even though this is a new conference for them, I think they're going to want to do it. And it's just, again, it's the record discrepancy. The records are totally misleading here. I'm sick of all these bracketologies having South Florida in there, really, man, because I think it's pretty unlikely. They're going to have to win this conference. Their strength of schedule is certainly way too weak for them to get in that large bid. For them to get into the tournament, they're going to have to win this conference, and I think that's not a very likely thing to happen. And I think Florida Atlantic's going to prove something here and show something. They are the much, much better team, as Ken Baum has them almost 70 ranking spots higher than South Florida here. He has FAU that much higher. FAU, the way better team, and they've played the stronger schedule. FAU -5. And then the other one, I will say I kind of lean, I'll just mention a couple of leans here. I do kind of lean against Minnesota, but the line's gone up from Minnesota 3-4 with 62% of the tickets and 83% of the cash. So they're public, but it looks like the cash is even more heavily on them with Minnesota. And that's just kind of crazy to think about. The public is on them because Minnesota has a better record than Rutgers. But Minnesota's been a covering machine this year. They have the best against the spread record all season in all of D1 college basketball. I think they're like 21-3 against the spread now or something like that. It's absolutely insane what they've been doing. Although in the last 2 games, they lost both games, but they still covered. Unfortunately for me, they covered by a half point against, or whatever it was, against Iowa. Which they were ahead for a lot of that game. Then they were losing by margin right at the end there. They hit a 3 to backdoor cover that one, I believe. So that's ridiculous there. And then they played pretty well against Purdue, which is why I don't like Minnesota here, because they were winning for like more than a half against Purdue, if I remember correctly. And the game was still pretty close coming down the wire. They went all out and played a really tough game against Purdue. So what are they going to have left in the tank here? I don't know. With Rutgers coming in, this is going to be an ugly style of game, man. So it's the type of game where I wouldn't really want to lay points either with either of these teams, because both of these teams, especially Rutgers, plays really good on the defensive side of the ball. And both of these teams like to play slower, play ugly, low-scoring games. So in a type of game like that, you tend to want to be on the underdog as well, and on the underdog if they have the better defense, which Rutgers does. They're actually one of the top defensive teams in the country, really. So I lean to Rutgers in that one, but it's not what I'm going to get there with. The market looks pretty strongly against it, which is kind of crazy to me, because I do think Minnesota's in a hangover spot off the big game against Purdue. Rutgers also kind of coming off a big game as well against Northwestern, but that was also a letdown spot because they had beaten Wisconsin the game before then. They didn't play as well against Northwestern. They actually had to come back. Northwestern was beating them for the majority of that game, I think, and Rutgers came back and won. And I think Rutgers won and didn't cover at home in that one. So Rutgers might be in a better spot to have some focus in this one. So I do lean to Rutgers. I lean to SMU just because I think this is a power ratings discrepancy against Memphis. Even though SMU is down from 5.5 to 4.5, they have 75% of the tickets, but 94% of the cash. So looks like one of those types of games where the recreational bettors aren't really wanting to get involved that much in this game. But record-wise, and people know who Memphis is. Like, they know the name Memphis, even though SMU's ahead of them record-wise. Now, Memphis was in the rankings for a while, but they were so massively overrated when they were in the rankings. Memphis just has not really gotten it together with Penny Hardaway there. They just have not really done it. I mean, they won the conference they were in last year. I think, was it still this conference? And Houston moved out of this conference? I think it was. I guess Houston was here in this conference last year and then moved out of the conference. I think that was the case. I don't even know, but Memphis won whatever conference. I think it was this conference. They won this conference. They had beaten a Houston team in the conference final where Houston was down Sasser, and Houston, even if they lost that game, they knew they were going to be a 1 seed. So they pretty much were locked into a 1 seed and knew they couldn't jump Alabama to get the top overall seed. So Houston didn't have much reason to play in that conference final. Really, Memphis had reason to go all out there and wanted to make sure they were in the tournament. And then Memphis they did play pretty well against Florida Atlantic in the tournament, although they wound up losing a close game. But Memphis, I just think they're just not that good a team, man. In the Penny Hardaway era, they've not really gotten over the hump. They're not good, and they're still, like, they look better than... They're just considered to be better than they actually are, really. So I don't like Memphis at all. SMU, I do like SMU in this one. Neither team's really coming off anything good, although SMU does have FAU next. But I don't think they're going to overlook Memphis either. And SMU did lose the first matchup at Memphis, although SMU covered. They were a 6.5-point underdog in that game, and SMU was way ahead for more than half of that game, really. And then Memphis came back and won the game. SMU shot horribly, shot 14.3% from three and 33.8% from the field. So probably an outlier there. I would not expect SMU to shoot that poorly at home in this one. And Ken Baum actually has this way, way higher on the number. He has SMU at like 7 or something like that. He has SMU ranked so much higher than Memphis. Memphis carrying a lot of name recognition. He has SMU at 42nd in the country. He has them only at 314th in luck. So one of the least lucky teams in the country. Let me see. And he has them playing at 201st in tempo, so a much, much slower tempo. So they're probably going to slow this game down, whereas Memphis likes to play at a much faster tempo at 22nd. And he has Memphis at 98th in luck. So and he has Memphis down at 83rd ranking-wise. So he has SMU like 40 ranking spots higher than Memphis. So this looks like a line where the line is just a line because everybody knows the name Memphis. Memphis won the first meeting, so I have a fairly strong lean to SMU in that one, really, because I think the number is actually kind of far off. It's almost one that I kind of want to jump in and play and lay the points with SMU. So I like SMU. Now, this video is going to go really long just to talk about 3 plays here, but I do like SMU. It's just there isn't that much of a situation there, although it is an in-season revenge type of spot for SMU, although Memphis will know that SMU did also play really tough against them and lose the game, even though SMU shot so poorly in that game, they're still winning most of that game. So SMU is definitely the better team in this one. And as I just gave you all the Ken Palm stats there, SMU being the much less lucky team, but also SMU plays a much slower pace game, and they're probably going to be able to control the pace at home here. So I think that's going to frustrate Memphis and throw Memphis out of their the way that they like to play. Memphis likes to play way faster than SMU does. So I think that's going to ugly up the game and get the game into a style that Memphis is not comfortable with and does not like. So I expect SMU to win that one. What's the other game I'm actually on? Well, the other game I'm actually on, the market has actually shifted into agreement with me, where the market percentages looked like they were in disagreement with me earlier in the morning, and I said I don't care because I like the spot too much. I'm playing Evansville against Illinois State. I mean, this is a classic spot for me, man, where Illinois State, they got 69% of the tickets, but only 59% of the cash. So it looks like they are kind of a public team there with the cash discrepancy now going against them, even though Evansville does actually have the better overall record. So that scares me a little bit, just because having the team with the better overall record getting points tends to not be the best scenario. They tend to wind up being like a square dog, but they're not the square dog in this case. Looking at the percentages, this is just a major, major letdown spot for Illinois State, man. It's like, what are they going to have left in the tank? Illinois State, they just won at Indiana State, man. Indiana State's now lost 2 in a row after they only had 1 loss in conference and 3 losses on the season. They slipped up against Illinois State, and then they could not recover. I think it was a hangover spot for Indiana State yesterday, where because they lost that first game, it just hung over into the next game. When you lose like a long, long win streak like they did, sometimes it carries over into the second game. And they lost at Southern Illinois yesterday, which is not an easy spot for Indiana State to be in, but they lost at home to Illinois State, which is one of the most ridiculous upsets of the season, right? That was a 17.5-point upset where Illinois State was way, way ahead in that game. And then Indiana State came back and took the lead in the second half, and it looked like, well, Indiana State just, they ran out of steam here. It's over. But no, it was not over. They still wound up winning the game. And it was an absurdly bad shooting performance from Indiana State with 21% from 3 and 36% from the field. That is a lot lower than you're accustomed to seeing from Indiana State, And Illinois State shot 51.8 from the field and only 25 from 3. So it was not a good 3-point shooting game from either side, but 51.8 from the field against an Indiana State team. That's just ridiculous. That's an outlier. Coming off a massive, massive upset, win of the year type of stuff for Illinois State, beating like the top team in the conference, a ranked team. Teams in this conference aren't used to being ranked and aren't used to playing ranked opponents like this, and going in on the road and doing it. That's just an insane upset that Illinois State pulled off. I don't know what they're going to have left in the tank here, even though they are playing an Evansville team they actually lost to at Evansville earlier this year. Evansville actually won by 4 points in a very slow game, and Illinois State was actually the road favorite. And that one, Illinois State only shot 4.8% from three in that game. Neither team shot well at all in that game, especially from three. Not a good shooting performance in that game, a very low scoring game. So Illinois State, I think they are going to remember that a little bit. So that's a little bit of a drawback here, where there might be a little bit of in-season revenge here. And Evansville is coming off a pretty good game themselves. They played Drake really tough, although Drake wound up getting into the lead with a decent amount of time left, and the final score is actually closer than the score was. Like, Drake pretty much had the game put away with like 4 minutes left or so, I would say, in that game. But it was a good performance from Evansville. Both teams actually shot pretty well in that game. But even so, I think Illinois State's just in such a monster letdown spot off of that win over Indiana State. It's a spot where I have to go against them. And the market looks like it's agreeing with me now. Ken Palm only has this lined at 3. So even though Evansville is the team with the better record, I think he has Evansville also as the slightly better team here. He does, only by 6 ranking points, though. But still, the game is lined like Illinois State's the slightly better team. Which I don't know why the odds makers are maybe some of the odds makers have them as the better team because it is close, but I don't really think so. So even though if the odds makers are telling you a team with a worse record is actually the better team, I tend to listen a little bit, but in this case, I'm not going to listen to that. I do think that Evansville is actually the slightly better team, and Illinois State's coming off just such a monster game. I just think they're going to be like feeling very, very high on themselves. And even though they did lose to Evansville on the road this year, I don't know. It's at least not a situation where they lost at home to Evansville, although maybe that will be the case after this game is done. But I think it's just such a bad spot for Illinois State. I like Evansville, plus 4.5. And finishing this off, we're going to hockey. I got one play here. This line's moving up. So this is one where like you're losing the line value pretty quickly on this one. On the Pittsburgh Penguins, this is what I'm doing here. The rest discrepancy is just crazy in this game. It's kind of similar to the Columbus game I played yesterday. Pittsburgh is up from minus 115 to minus 124. 60% of the tickets, but 81% of the cash. So they do have the cash discrepancy on them. It looks like the market is in agreement with Pittsburgh on this one. The line's moving up on Pittsburgh. I believe you can still get them at around the 124 price there. That might be the best you can do right now. I think it's moving up further. I see some 130s out there now. I think it's a much better spot for Pittsburgh. Even though Pittsburgh, I think they're not the better team. Although this line is basically lining them, giving them a little bit more than home ice, really. Home ice is usually like minus 120 or so. But then, of course, the line is factoring in the rest discrepancy a little bit. So Pittsburgh needs to get a little bit extra for the rest situation. But I don't think that's quite accounting for it, even though LA is the better team. This is a bad spot for LA, not just because of the rest scenario, but they're in a huge letdown spot too. And I don't think you can really quite account for how bad the situation is for the Kings here. They're playing a 4th straight road game. They've been on the road since February 13th. They played one home game coming out of the All-Star break, beat Edmonton 4-0, a huge win. Then they went on the road, and they were in a letdown spot after that and had a real bad game, losing 7-0 to Buffalo. That's pretty unacceptable, really, just an ugly performance. But then they haven't lost since then. They went on the road, won at New Jersey, who's a decent team, decent win. And then last night, they went into Boston, and they played a real barn burner of a game against my Bruins. The Bruins kind of outplayed them, man. It was a very physical game with a lot of hits from both sides. Bruins were winning the game for a lot of the game. They were winning 3-1 in the second period. The Bruins never trailed in the game except for the final score. That was the only time LA even had the lead. The Bruins kind of dominated the game. They had a much higher face-off percentage. LA had more shots, but it was because LA was losing for a lot of the game. The Bruins blew the game, man. Very unfortunate. The Bruins blew leads of 1-0, 2-1, 3-1, 3-2, 4-3. They blew all those leads. The Bruins never trailed until the overtime score. And they gave up a goal in the final 30 seconds of overtime. That's a dramatic win for LA. Very tough game, very physical game. And they're coming off that, and they have to play again right away with no time off. And it's a little bit of an earlier game too, because that was a night game at least last night. This game is a little bit earlier at 6 p.m. Eastern. and having to travel. It's a back-to-back. It's a third game in 4 days, all in different cities on the road. And it's a fourth game in 6 days, all on the road, all in different cities. Although they don't have a big game up next, only Columbus. But that's got to take its toll, man. So they're in like a big letdown spot, hangover spot, but whatever you want to call it, from that massive game last night. LA has actually won at the Bruins a couple times in the last couple of years. I remember one of the games they won last year. I think Bruins had a bad spot, like returning home from a long Pacific Coast road trip or something, and LA came in and caught them. LA has been hurting the Bruins at home, which sucks for me. As a Bruins fan, this is my Bruins hat that I have on too, and I'm not feeling great here. I'm going with the Happy Gilmore style, flipping it back around, backwards hat time. Maybe that'll give the Bruins some new energy or something. But horrible spot for LA for all the reasons I just said. They have no rest at all. They've been playing games in all these different cities, coming off the biggest win of the road trip there, even though, yeah, they're not going to want to fall to 2-2 on the road trip, but 2-2 wouldn't be the worst road trip either, especially with some tough games like this. Beating the Bruins, that's like the peak of the road trip there. Huge game there. Now they have to go to Pittsburgh, and Pittsburgh has been off for, and they've had 2 days off. They haven't played since the 15th. So they are the much, much more rested team. They did play a road game prior. They played a couple games in quick sequence before that. But since the 15th, they've been off for 2 days. So I think they're going to be completely focused on this game. They don't really have anything that big up next. They do have the Islanders and Montreal up next, which they are Eastern Conference games. So the LA Kings have been a pretty good team, man. You have the LA Kings coming into your house. I think you're going to want to do something here. The last time Pittsburgh played, they won at Chicago, which obviously not that impressive. Chicago very much struggling this year, one of the worst teams in hockey. Pittsburgh, I don't think they had really like any like momentum to break or anything like that. If anything, that win against Chicago broke the momentum they had, because they lost 3 straight games before that, but they were at Minnesota, which is not an easy place to go and win there. I think I might have been on that game, actually. I don't remember if I was on Minnesota in that one. I can't remember. Then they went to Winnipeg after that. Also a tough place. They played pretty well in that game, only losing by 1 in a tough road game at Winnipeg. Then they had a few days off, played Florida, should have been rested, but Florida quite good, and they lost at home, back at home to Florida, even though they had a couple extra days off, and probably a game where you expect Pittsburgh to be a bit focused there, but lost that game. Then they went into Chicago and broke their losing momentum there with that win. Now they've had a couple more days off, which I think is going to help them prepare for this. They have the much, much better rest spot here in LA. Not only are they in a bad rest spot, having to play all these games in just a few days in all these different cities away from home, but they are also in a major letdown off the huge win over the Bruins. I think they might run out of steam. I like the Pittsburgh Penguins minus 124. You can get it. That's pretty much all you can do. You can get it around minus 124 right now, but it looks like minus 130 is kind of where it's headed, where it's out there right now. So those plays one more time. FAU minus 5 in college basketball. Evansville plus 4.5. Pittsburgh Penguins minus 124. Let's finally string together 2 winning days in a row, man. Come on. Let's have a good Sunday. Peace.